Hey guys. So today we're going to jump back into chapter 16. We're on page 327 if you want to follow along in your book. But this section and what we're going to be talking about the next couple of days is going to be focusing on just this expansion of transportation, mainly through railroads and new technologies that are kind of popping up around the country. Just to review very quickly before we jump into this chapter is all about growth after the war, after Reconstruction. What's the country going to become now? How are we going to expand and grow and industrialize? And we've talked about earlier in this chapter, we talked about the resources we have as a country and why we were able to industrialize so quickly after Reconstruction. And those were just the abundance of natural resources we have in our country, like as far as raw materials go, but also the people that are here, the workforce, and immigrants coming into the country and their ability to help and contribute to the expansion of industry within the United States. So this section, we're going to continue talking about that some and how this abundance of raw materials out west, especially, and these new people, how that helped, like with the railroads, building the railroads and stuff like that. So that's the plan for today. So let's go ahead and jump into it. All right. So with the railroads, let's talk about the need for them and then some of the problems that existed with the current railroad system, because railroads were not some new innovation after the war. Obviously, they had been around. They were very useful during the war in transporting goods and troops throughout the different battlefields and stuff like that. So they've been around and they have shown their usefulness. This is just going to talk about how they expand as after the war and move, especially out west as more people move out there. So the benefit of railroads and trains is their ability to transport not only people, but more importantly, goods in a large quantity. So they can move a lot of things at one time. Just like the invention of steamboats and steamships helped with trade across the globe and helped speed up that process, railroads are going to do the same thing just within the actual United States. So moving goods and people from within the borders of the United States and speeding up that process. So that's the benefit of it. And it's going to help, especially if you think about, we've talked about the abundance of resources and raw goods out west especially. And as we tap into those resources, raw materials are just raw materials. They don't have much value until you process them into something that someone wants to buy for the most part. So, a tree is just a tree until you send it to a sawmill and it's processed into lumber or paper or whatever it is. So all of these raw materials out west are great, but they don't have much worth until they're actually processed and manufactured. And that's where railroads come in, because the industry that exists, the factories that exist, are largely in the north and the northeast at this point. And they will expand south and to the west over time, but that's going to take longer. So the easier thing to do is just to move the goods to where the factories already exist instead of just building a bunch of factories where the goods are. So that's what railroads are going to do, is being able to ship those raw materials to the factories that already exist in other parts of the country. Now, there are a couple of problems with the railroad system that exists in the middle of the 1800s and as we kind of move into this period of time. So in 1860, at the time of the war, and the Civil War actually kind of brings to light a lot of the problems that existed in the railroad system. So in 1860, most of the tracks that existed in the east, or most of the tracks existed in the east, which we've talked about, especially in the northern part. There were some in the south. There are hardly any railroads west of the Mississippi River, which is where we need them at this point in history. So most of them are in the east. On top of that, they don't cross any of the major rivers. At that time, there's not really any bridges that cross over the Hudson River, the Ohio, or the Mississippi River. So railroad systems that exist out east kind of stop at those rivers, and they don't cross over into anything else. Another problem that existed was the gauges that were used. So the gauge on a railroad is the width between the two rails. You can see the picture on your screen right here. So there was all kinds of different widths between the two rails on the tracks, depending on who the company was that was building these tracks, who was using them. So the two most common, you really had narrow gauge, which is 3.5 feet wide, which you can see on your screen there. And then you had a wider gauge, which was 4 foot 8.5. So those were the two kind of predominant gauges. So two of the major innovations that happen as we come out of the war and Reconstruction is, first of all, the creation of bridges across these rivers, and second of all, the settling of on a what's called a standard gauge. So a size that every company, every builder of railroads is going to use, and that is the 4 foot 8.5 inch standard gauge. That's the wider one between the two. And why they settled on that, and this is kind of common sense if you just think about it, the wider the bases that the train is riding on, the heavier load they can carry. So they can transport a heavier weight. They can also travel at a higher speed without the fear of derailing. So that's why they settled on that wider of the two gauges that have been used. And for obvious reasons, this is important, because if you think about it, if a track, I'll just give you an actual example. So between New York City and Chicago, there was a rail system that traveled between these two major cities, which is great because, as we talked about, trains can move people and goods at a higher rate of speed. So let's just take people, for example. If you were traveling from New York City to Chicago via train in the middle of the 1800s, you would have to get off and reboard a different train 6 times, because 6 different times the train had to stop because the gauges changed. If you think about what a train looks like, I mean, you can't just adjust the width of the wheels on the train. Like, they're set. The tracks are set. So you have to get on a completely new train as the gauges of the tracks change. So settling on that new gauge, or that standard gauge, is extremely important because it makes the efficiency of the railroad system that much more efficient just by doing that. So those are two major innovations that take place in the railroad system at that time. The other major thing to happen is the consolidation of railroads. So consolidation is basically when a bunch of small railroad lines or railroad companies all join together. They consolidate. I think, like for me, I hear that term consolidation, I think more about schools. Like, that happens a lot with small schools in rural areas of the state. They consolidate and join together and become one school system. That's all this is. So in the middle of the 1800s, you had a bunch of small companies that were just these individual rail lines. And that's why you had those different gauges, as they would build their own individual rail lines. So nothing was together. Everything was separate and just kind of this mix match system of railroads. So consolidation, what that does, you've got two predominant people. J. Edgar Thompson is one, and then Cornelius Vanderbilt is really the main person, probably the one you've actually heard about, because he's actually what Vanderbilt University is named after. He was kind of the first major donor to help pay for that university. But what he did is he bought out all of these smaller rail lines. Vanderbilt, for example, he was up in the Northeast in New York City and had this vision, this dream, I guess, of connecting all of that Great Lake region via rail. And to do that, he had to buy out all of these small companies and bring them all under his umbrella, under his roof, so that it would all be the same. It would be all be the same system, and would make it that much more effective. So to do that, it's just a business decision. It's literally convincing, because he owns his own company, own railroad company, and he's competing against, like any other business, like whatever it is, you compete against other people. That's what capitalism is, which we'll actually talk about later in this chapter. So he has to convince his competitors, the ones he's up against, to actually join him and sell to him their companies, which is no easy task. So he's able to do that, and the consolidation of railroads kind of feeds into the standard gauge and the building of bridges. All of these things kind of come together and makes the efficiency of rail travel much better in the United States. And why that's important is in this period of growth for our country and growing industrially out west and into the south, anything we can do to make that more efficient is just going to speed up that the process. And the United States is not unique in industrializing. Like most places in the world industrialize. The unique thing about the United States at this time is the speed in which they're able to do that. They industrialize much quicker than most other countries around the world. And it's for reasons like the people that are able to, that the immigrants that come in, the resources we have, the ability to consolidate and standardize our railroad system is going to help in speeding up that process. Okay, so as we get in a little bit more into this chapter, like we'll start talking about one of the first major. We're going to talk about specific rail lines like the Transcontinental Railroad, and that's kind of this big venture from the United States to build a rail system that stretches from pretty much coast to coast. So we'll talk about that some tomorrow, and what all of this is going to mean for the country and different rail systems that exist throughout the country. Real quick, just to kind of wrap up, yesterday y'all watched a crash course video and had a little journal, and it talks about this and kind of the rail system. It goes into some other areas of what this actually means for the country. And I just briefly wanted to touch on this. Y'all did, in large part, a really good job at kind of answering the question in the journal, but really what the rail system does I've talked about from just the big picture stuff for the country and industrializing, but for individual people, what it does is it kind of changes our way of life. And hopefully you got that from the video. It seems like y'all did from reading your journal stuff, but it changes the way we view the world. Like we're able to travel to places we weren't able to at a much faster speed, even just literally the way we view the world. Where before, if you were riding a stagecoach or horse, you're just kind of slowly going and taking in the country and stuff. Now you're traveling on railroads at a high rate of speed, and you're just seeing glimpses through the window as you look out, and it literally changes the way we view things. And on top of that, it changes the way that we interact with each other. And it mentions this in the video, how this is where, as people travel, they start to read books and stuff instead of communicating with each other face to face like you normally would if you were on a stagecoach or something. It's slowly changing who we are as Americans, and that's something that still exists today, right? Like we don't read books, we just get on our phones and we're attached to our screen. So even in the late 1800s, that's the communication, person-person interaction is something that is starting to change even at that early stage. And then the second thing was this idea of change and how people were afraid of it. And this actually touches on some stuff we talked about in our Zoom meeting on Tuesday, how like we've talked a lot about fear lately, especially in that, and how one of the big contributors to fear is this fear of the unknown, this fear of not being in control, that kind of stuff. And that's what's happening. You can kind of see it playing out right there, how people don't know people are losing control of their way of life. And for people that are comfortable and like where things are, when stuff is changing very rapidly like it is back then, they're not always comfortable with that because they are losing control of their own life. They don't know what's going to happen next, and people don't like that. That's why you always hear, people don't like change, because people get comfortable, they get their routines, and when you start to disrupt that, it makes people uncomfortable and can lead to a lot of fear. And the other thing is, one of the things I like the most about that crash course video is his point that change does not always mean progress. Just because something is different doesn't mean it's better, right? And for people, as the United States is changing, does that mean we are making progress as a country? In some cases, the answer is yes. Like we are progressing, we're in different areas of life, but in some ways, as we change, we're digressing, we're losing ground. Kind of like the example of how we interact with each other and how we view the world. That's changing, and it's not necessarily for the better. So change doesn't always mean progress, and people are very reluctant to change for those reasons. So that's all I got for today. We will pick up in the next video about talking about the Transcontinental Railroad and all of that stuff. For your attendance, here's what I need you to do and kind of submit for me. We talked about the different railroad gauges and stuff like that, and they settled on the standard gauge that would be used as railroads were being built into the future. So I need you to tell me, what is the standard gauge? So in feet and inches, what is the width between the two rails that they settled on as the standard gauge? That is your attendance. And that's all I got for you guys. All right. Talk to y'all later.